The outcome of the 1920 arbitration process that followed recognition of IBOA was a clear victory for the new organisation. The Arbitration Board, chaired by the Lord Chancellor of Ireland, Sir James Campbell, recommended increases in basic rates, the introduction of a common incremental scale for all permanent employees, and many other benefits. The scale of IBOA's success meant that for most of the 1920s, pay was no longer a contentious issue. And in the 1930s, as Irish banking struggled through the Great Depression, IBOA held tightly to the agreement, the Magna Charta, as the new organising secretary J.T. Donovan described it in 1932. This was compounded in the Free State by the economic war with the UK, while in Northern Ireland, economic stagnation prompted mass protests by unemployed workers. The outbreak of World War II brought emergency powers in the north, including the removal of the right to strike, and the emergency in the south with pay curbs for all workers. When the war ended, members demanded progress on issues deferred during hostilities. With pay in the north lagging behind the south, grassroots pressure led to a vote for industrial action in the spring of 1946. After negotiations at Stormont broke down, a 5-week strike ensued before a settlement was reached. When the same terms were proposed for the south, they were accepted, but so narrowly that the discontent rumbled on through 1947. Eventually, a new agreement brought improvements in pay and other benefits, such as a 1-hour lunch break. But the deal was a truce rather than a settlement, as dissatisfaction continued into the next decade. Hostilities resumed in 1950 under a new organising secretary, John Titterington. With talks deadlocked, IBOA members in the Republic went on strike after Christmas. With banks closed throughout January 1951, a new government-backed arbitration process resulted in improvements in pay and other terms, which ended the 7-week strike. 2 weeks later, in Belfast, similar terms were agreed between IBOA and banks in Northern Ireland. Skirmishes continued during the 1950s, at times involving limited industrial action, until the Conroy Conference, convened in 1955, delivered improvements in pay and other terms, as well as new conciliation machinery on both sides of the border. The economic upturn of the 1960s was accompanied by a period of major restructuring of Irish banking. Alongside the mergers and amalgamations, the banks also broadened their business model to target the disposable incomes of the growing cohorts of industrial workers by encouraging them to set up bank accounts. With workloads increasing, IBOA wanted improvements in overtime pay and weekend and bank holiday rates. To avert threats of industrial action in Northern Ireland and the Republic, a joint industrial council was set up in 1964. After the council's deliberations, the banks conceded the IBOA claim, but only after members north and south had indicated that they would ban overtime unless the improvements were agreed. As the surge in economic activity brought price inflation in its wake, workers in Ireland made demands for higher pay in 1966. IBOA lodged claims for general pay rises in both the Republic and the North against a backdrop of substantial increases in bank profits. When the banks refused to improve their offer, IBOA took industrial action. After 6 weeks, members in the North voted to accept an improved offer from the banks. In the Republic, the dispute rumbled on, and after 12 weeks of industrial action, members voted reluctantly to accept the bank's earlier offer. During the 12-week stalemate in the Republic, many bank officials headed over to Britain to take up temporary work in pubs, factories, offices and building sites to sustain themselves until the dispute was settled. One such was IBOA member Christopher Andrew Moore from the National Bank in Clonmel, who decided that he would never return to banking. The disappointment felt by many members at the outcome of the 1966 strike was eased in 1968, when agreement on a new salary scale was brokered through the Joint Industrial Council. But soaring inflation at the start of the 1970s prompted a renewed clamour for a pay rise. The executive argued that the terms of the 1968 deal required the banks to compensate staff for the exceptional rise in prices by 1970. The arbitrator, Professor Martin O'Donoghue, ruled that rampant inflation did not justify any compensation. When IBOA members protested by working restricted hours, the banks threatened a 25% pay cut. Tensions escalated throughout April until the banks closed their doors in a lockout that lasted 6.5 months. With most members finding alternative temporary work, many in Britain again, the Executive Committee could insist on decent terms before recommending a return to work. A 36% rise for junior officials and a 23% rise for senior officials. With Job Stott now behind the General Secretary's desk, IBOA faced a new challenge in 1975 as the Irish government began to adopt a more interventionist approach to pay in banking. A new law brought about a temporary pay freeze for bank staff, while the Labour Court reviewed a pay deal agreed earlier. When the court reported that bank staff would earn 7% more than the terms of the National Wage Agreement, IBOA proposed to take a smaller increase, a proposal that was narrowly accepted in a ballot. Worse was to follow in 1976, when the government announced new laws to ensure that bank officials did not receive increases out of line with the rest of the economy. Even though the banks and IBOA operated outside the framework of the national agreements between unions and employers, the government was determined to corral them into accepting their parameters. So, with management now relieved of any pressure to reach a deal with IBOA, a strike was inevitable. This time, with little alternative work available in Britain or Ireland, in the depressed economic conditions resulting from the oil crisis, members were unable to sustain a prolonged strike, and after 2 months out, they voted to accept pay proposals from an independent adjudicator. The recession of the 1980s provided limited scope for progress on pay. Though IBOA's gains were modest in themselves, they were generally better than those achieved by other worker groups. A key focus of the union's bargaining activity with the banks was the Technology and Change Agreement, brokered in 1982 after talks at the Joint Industrial Council and the Labour Court, and later extended to Northern Ireland and Britain. The deal was widely seen as a triumph for IBOA, winning admiration from finance unions around Europe. A week-long strike by members in Britain in 1985 secured an improvement on an earlier arbitration award. However, in a portent of the divisions to come in 1992, pressure from management induced 20% of the members in Britain to pass the pickets. Many of these were subsequently suspended or expelled from the union. The secret pay rise for managers in 1991 was one of the earliest attempts to introduce an element of performance-related pay into Irish banking. Northern Bank expanded its scope in 1994, applying it widely amongst its staff as part of a broader cost reduction restructuring programme. This was soon replicated by the other Irish banks. While ordinary staff also received some very modest rewards through gain-sharing schemes designed to facilitate staff reductions, these were insignificant compared to the highly lucrative returns for senior managers within Irish banking, as General Secretary Larry Broderick noted at the time. Voluntary severance packages removed many experienced officials who, if they were replaced at all, were supplanted by younger and, from the employer's perspective, cheaper recruits. So as Irish banking entered the new millennium, it experienced a significant depletion of institutional memory, especially at local level. Key decisions were passed up the line to head offices, where impersonal algorithms came to be more valued than individual judgment or local knowledge. So the evaluation of loan applications was increasingly reduced to a box-ticking exercise. This disconnect from customers was exacerbated by a new approach to pay, which rewarded performance measured not by the quality of service and value to customers, but by the quantity of sales and profit for the institution. These factors contributed to a substantial change in the culture of Irish banking. The principles of prudence and long-term sustainability gave way to a much more speculative approach, taking higher risks in pursuit of higher rewards. Amid the cutthroat hysteria of the Celtic Tiger years, even relatively conservative lenders were drawn into increasingly risky practices under pressure from less scrupulous competitors. In their pursuit of short-term personal gain in the form of major sales-related bonuses, banking leaders began to make decisions which were very bad from the perspective of the long-term interest of their banks. The regulatory authorities in Dublin and London, which should have held them to account, lacked the capacity or the will to intervene until it was far too late, with the result that Irish banking experienced the most devastating reverse in its entire history. The architects of the disaster have escaped largely unscathed, except for a few bruised egos. For a couple of years, they engaged in token expressions of contrition. But in fact, most have continued to be in denial, viewing themselves as unlucky to have been behind the wheel when the crash happened, rather than as the primary agents responsible for the crash. While this denial persists at the top levels of Irish banking, it's difficult to see how the underlying culture will change in any meaningful sense. The real victims of the disaster, of course, were the people of Ireland, North and South, who suffered the imposition of widespread austerity, reversing earlier economic advances and undermining social solidarity at the personal, community and national levels. And in finance, it has been the ordinary employees who have borne the brunt of the crisis. While the union successfully resisted the kind of cuts in basic pay which were imposed in other sectors, most bank staff suffered a reduction in overall living standards, since there were now no profits to share, and the performance-related element of their remuneration was also greatly reduced, since the volume of sales on which it had mainly been calculated was also significantly less, even though the work involved in dealing with distressed customers was substantial. At the same time, pension schemes were reconfigured so that employees generally paid more for fewer benefits. Meanwhile, the inexorable advance of technological innovation was facilitated by the crisis, as banks sought further cost savings, this time on the pretext of paying down state aid rather than pursuing profits per se, although the profit motive would eventually reassert itself when the immediate crisis passed. So although the union managed to delay the onset of job cuts in the immediate aftermath of the onset of the crisis, from 2012, IBOA found itself negotiating voluntary-led redundancy programs in many financial institutions, including the eventual winding down of Danske Bank's National Irish Bank operation in the Republic. As the financial sector has finally begun to return to profit, the prospects for further advances in living standards for employees have improved. The challenge for the Financial Services Union is to ensure that its members are rewarded on the basis of their efforts in providing good service to customers, rather than simply for their capacity to meet numerical targets based on sales.